The break room at Hargrove Regional Hospital smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent light, which was somehow its own kind of smell, and Ben Calloway had learned to ignore both the same way he had learned to ignore a lot of things since Annie died. He was not supposed to be there. The vending machine on the second floor was closer to the pediatric ward, where he was waiting for his daughter's discharge paperwork. But Sophie had asked for the orange crackers with the peanut butter inside. The ones that only came from the machines on the ground floor, near the staff corridor, and Ben had never once in 7 years told Sophie no about crackers. He fed $2 into the machine and listened to the mechanical arm drag the package forward when he heard the voice from the hallway not loud. That was the first thing that struck him. Men who screamed had obvious anger. This voice was worse, controlled, certain, designed to land without witnesses misunderstanding what it was. If you can't keep up with the intake schedule, maybe administration should reconsider whether this position suits someone at your level. Ben turned without meaning to. Through the half-open door, the hallway outside showed a man in a navy suit and visitor credentials around his neck standing very close to a hospital porter, a woman somewhere in her late 40s wearing green scrubs and a badge lanyard, holding a mop handle with both hands as though she needed it for balance. Her shoulders were doing the same thing Ben had seen in soldiers who had learned not to flinch in front of authority. Not stillness, exactly. The specific stillness of someone swallowing a reaction. The man in the navy suit adjusted the watch on his wrist and said something else Ben could not hear. Then he reached forward and tapped the woman's ID badge once with one finger, sharp and deliberate, like she was a display item he was appraising. Ben was already moving before he made the decision. The hallway was narrow. The man turned when Ben's footsteps registered, irritation already forming on his face before he understood what he was looking at. A guy in worn jeans and a jacket that had gone through too many wash cycles, carrying a pack of orange crackers, who had apparently decided this was his business. "You need something?" the man asked. "I heard you out here," Ben said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. "Thought I'd see if everything was all right." The woman glanced at him once, a quick and unreadable look, then returned her gaze to the middle distance the way people did when they were calculating how much worse things could get. The man smiled the way people smiled when they wanted to demonstrate they didn't feel threatened. "This is a private conversation between hospital staff and an administrative consultant. I'd suggest minding your own floor." Ben looked at him. "She's holding a mop and you're standing close enough that she can't step back. That's not really a conversation." Silence. The kind that came after someone said the thing everyone in the room had been carefully not saying. The man's expression changed. It did not get angrier. It got quieter, which was different. "Do you work here?" "No. Then you have absolutely no standing in this hallway." "Standing doesn't come from a badge," Ben said. The woman's hands shifted slightly on the mop handle, not loosening. But something in her posture had changed, a millimeter of difference that Ben recognized from the years he had spent around people who had stopped expecting anyone to notice them. The man stepped back once, not a retreat but a recalibration. He looked at Ben the way men who had never genuinely been challenged looked at people who challenged them, with the specific disbelief of someone who assumed the world had a clear hierarchy and was irritated to find a gap in it. "I manage 12 contracts across 3 hospital networks in this state," the man said. "I've been consulting for Hargrove since before this building's East Wing was funded, so when I say a department is underperforming, it tends to matter." Ben said nothing. He had learned that too, that silence in the right moment made people feel the weight of their own words more than any response could. The man turned back to the woman and his voice dropped again to that controlled register. "We'll finish this later." Then he walked away, polished shoes quiet on the linoleum. The hallway felt larger after he left. The woman exhaled once through her nose, very controlled. Then she looked at Ben with calm, dark eyes that had something behind them he couldn't immediately name. "You didn't have to do that, I know. He's going to be unpleasant about it." He seemed like he already was. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "You're waiting on someone?" "My daughter. Pediatric ward. She wanted crackers from the machine down here." The woman looked at the orange package in his hand. "The peanut butter ones. She's very specific." "How old?" "7. The woman nodded, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Go back to her," Ben said. "I still wanted to say something." She studied him for a second longer than felt ordinary. Then she said, "My name is Judith." It fit her plainly and immediately in a way names sometimes did. "Ben," he said. "Ben Calloway." She nodded once. Then she moved off down the hall, pushing her cart, and Ben walked back toward the elevator, and that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. He found out 3 days later when the calls started. The first was from a property management company he had never heard of, informing him that the renewal on the warehouse unit he used for his HVAC business was under administrative review. Ben asked what that meant. The person on the phones was apologetic and vague in equal measure, which meant it meant nothing good. The second call came from a city contractor who had used Ben's company for municipal building maintenance for 4 years without issue. The contractor sounded uncomfortable. He said something about a conflict of interest review, and he said it like someone reading from a card. Ben sat in his truck in the school pickup lane and stared at his phone after the second call. He thought about the man in the Navy suit. His first and last name had been visible on his visitor badge. Ben had read it reflexively the way he read everything, an old habit from a job he no longer had. The name was Douglas Fenn. He ran the name that night after Sophie was asleep. It took less than 10 minutes to find the scope of it. Douglas Fenn was a senior operations director at a company called Meridian Group, a consulting and real estate firm that managed vendor contracts for 6 of the 7 hospital networks across the state. He had been in the industry for 22 years. He had a LinkedIn profile with a headshot that looked exactly like a man who had never needed to soften his voice in his life. Ben closed his laptop. The warehouse unit housed everything: his equipment, his parts inventory, the second-hand diagnostic machines he had spent 3 years paying off. Losing it meant losing the business. Losing the business meant losing the income that held everything else steady. Sophie's school, the rented house with the yard she had decided was the best yard in the world because it had a tree she could climb. He made himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the dark and thought about what Annie would say. Annie had always been the one who said things plainly before he talked himself out of them. She would have said, "Figure out what you can actually do, not what you wish you could do." The next morning after drop-off, he drove back to Hargrove Regional. He did not have a plan. He had a direction, which sometimes had to be enough. He found the housekeeping staff break area on the ground floor. A man with kind eyes and a name badge that said Gerald told him he hadn't seen Judith that morning yet, but he said her full name when he said it, Judith Harlan, with the slight extra weight people used when referring to someone they respected. Ben thanked him and waited. She arrived 20 minutes later and stopped when she saw him, her expression unreadable but unsurprised, as though she had expected this and was deciding how to respond to it. "The warehouse unit," Ben said, "and 2 service contracts in 3 days." Judith looked at him steadily. "I know, you know. Douglas Fenn doesn't operate quietly when he's making a point. The point is always that you shouldn't have gotten in his way." Ben controlled his expression. "And yet here you are, not surprised." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Walk with me." They went down the service corridor that ran alongside the loading dock, which was louder than it looked from the noise of delivery trucks outside. Judith walked with the measured pace of someone whose job required constant movement and who had long since stopped wasting energy. "I wasn't working in housekeeping when you saw me," she said. Ben waited. "I mean, I was. I've been here 4 days, but not as an employee." She paused beside a fire door propped open, 2 inches cool morning air coming through the gap. Meridian Group has held the vendor management contract for Hargrove since 2018. In the last 2 years, there have been 14 internal complaints filed by hospital staff about conduct from Meridian's consulting personnel. None of them resulted in formal review. 6 of the complainants are no longer employed here. Ben looked at her carefully. 6, the hospital's board is majority controlled by 3 trustees who have financial relationships with Meridian, not illegal on its face, complicated when it comes to oversight. She looked back at him. "I was here to document." "Document," Ben repeated. "For who?" Judith met his eyes for the first time since they'd been standing still. "I'm the Director of Healthcare Compliance Operations for the State Attorney General's office." Ben looked at her for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly. And Douglas Fenn had no idea. He knew there was a review initiated. He didn't know it was me. Something in her expression was difficult to place. Not guilt, but a kind of careful honesty. "He does now. Because of me. Because he reacted to you in front of 2 security cameras, a staff nurse who was walking the far end of the hall, and a dietary aide who recorded the first 40 seconds on his personal phone." Ben processed this. "But none of that helps me with the contracts." "No," Judith said plainly. "It doesn't. Not yet." Ben leaned against the concrete wall. "My daughter, 7 years old. Her mom died 2 years ago. The business is everything we have left that isn't grief." He said it simply, not for effect. Just because it was true and he was tired of not saying true things. "So, what I need to know is whether any of this actually leads somewhere, or whether you're going to tell me I have to sit tight and trust the process while he finishes pulling the floor out from under me." Judith absorbed this without looking away. He's going to escalate before anything formal can move. That's his pattern. When someone doesn't submit quickly, he finds a different angle. What angle? She hesitated once, the first hesitation Ben had seen from her. He's already contacted the school district facilities coordinator. Your daughter's school uses a contract HVAC company for their building systems. He's suggesting your license should be pulled for review. Ben's expression didn't change. It took effort. I need 2 more days to build what I need to build, Judith said. I'm asking you to hold, and what do I tell Sophie if the school calls? Judith looked at him. For a moment she was not a state official or an investigator. She was simply a person standing in a cold corridor understanding the cost she was asking someone else to pay. I'm sorry, she said. I mean that plainly. Sorry is accurate, Ben said. It just doesn't hold very much. He left without knowing what he was going to do. That afternoon, Sophie came home from school with a drawing she had made of the two of them standing in front of a house with a yard and a tree. She had labeled it, Me and Dad. Our house. She had drawn him taller than he was and herself with a crown, which seemed about right. Ben put it on the refrigerator and looked at it while he made dinner and thought about a lot of things. His phone rang at 7:22. Unknown number, he answered. A man's voice, pleasant and neutral, said, Mr. Calloway, I work for Douglas Fenn. He'd like you to understand that the current situation is entirely resolvable. A letter of apology to Mr. Fenn regarding your conduct at the hospital, and a formal agreement not to make statements about the incident publicly. That's all this requires. Ben said nothing for a moment. Mr. Calloway? I'm here. Mr. Fenn is a reasonable person. He simply expects a certain level of professional courtesy. Ben looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. Sophie's crown, the tree in the yard. Tell him no, Ben said. Tell him I said exactly that. He hung up. 2 minutes later, his phone lit up with a text from the Warehouse Property Management Company. Inspection scheduled for tomorrow, possible code violations under review. He set the phone face down on the counter. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas. She was small for her age, and her eyes were Annie's eyes, which was a fact that still hit Ben differently depending on the hour. Dad, are we going to be okay? He crouched to her level. He thought about lying. He had never been able to lie to her, and she had always known it immediately. We're going to be stubborn, he said. That's basically the same thing. She thought about this seriously. Is it, though? In our family, it is. That made her laugh once, short and surprised. And she went back to bed, and Ben sat at the kitchen table with his old service notebook open in front of him and wrote down every detail he could remember from the hospital hallway. Every word Douglas Fenn had said, the exact placement of the visitor badge, the name of the nurse he had seen at the far end of the hall, the timestamp on his phone when he had walked back to the elevator. He was not a lawyer. He was not a state official. He was a man with a service notebook and a 7-year-old who drew crowns on herself in her self-portraits. But he had always believed that the most honest thing you could bring to an unfair fight was a clear record of what actually happened. By morning, the inspection notice had been walked back. Clerical error, the property manager said, with the rehearsed calm of someone who had made a second phone call after the first one. Ben did not allow himself to read that as good news. He allowed himself to note it and continue. At 9:15, Judith Harlan called him. He filed a formal complaint with the hospital's Patient Services Board stating that you harassed him in the corridor and created an environment of intimidation for Meridian staff. Her voice was measured. The hospital is required to respond on record. When? The response window opens this afternoon. There will be a meeting. Am I invited? A brief pause. You can request to be present as a witness to the incident. Given that the incident occurred in a public corridor and involved a third party, you have standing. You're asking me to walk into a hospital boardroom. I'm informing you that you have the option. Ben was quiet for a second. Will you be there? I'll be there in my professional capacity. He looked out the window at Sophie's tree in the backyard. Still bare from the end of winter, the kind of scraggly bare that still somehow held its shape. I'll be there, he said. The boardroom at Hargrove Regional was on the 4th floor and felt precisely like every room Ben had ever entered where people expected to control outcomes before anyone arrived. Long table, padded chairs, water pitchers in the center, a wall of windows looking out over the hospital's parking structure, which was not quite inspiring. 5 people were already seated when Ben was shown in by an administrator who seemed unsure how to classify him. 2 were hospital trustees. He recognized that immediately from how they held their posture, people accustomed to being treated as decisions rather than participants. 1 was a woman who introduced herself as the hospital's legal counsel. 1 was a man Ben did not know who wore a Meridian Group lanyard. Douglas Fenn was at the far end of the table, in the same Navy suit, looking at Ben with the precise expression of a man who expected this to be brief and confirmatory. Judith Harlan entered from a side door 30 seconds after Ben sat down. She was dressed differently now, dark blazer, state-issued credentials visible, a folder under her arm. She sat without ceremony. The shift in the room was immediate and small and unmistakable. Fenn's jaw tightened by approximately nothing, but Ben noticed. The hospital's legal counsel began with a procedural summary. Fenn's complaint, the corridor incident, the formal request for the hospital to review and respond. Then Fenn spoke. His voice the same quality Ben remembered, controlled, practiced, certain. This individual confronted me in a restricted staff corridor, inserted himself into an employment conversation, and made statements suggesting I had acted improperly toward a member of the housekeeping staff. This created a hostile environment for consulting staff and damaged my professional standing during a contracted engagement. He did not look at Judith once. The legal counsel turned to Ben. Mr. Calloway, do you wish to provide your account? Ben looked once at Sophie's crown in his mind, the crayon kind, imprecise and certain, and then he spoke. On the afternoon of Tuesday the 14th, I was in the ground floor corridor outside the staff break area retrieving something from the vending machine for my daughter in pediatric. I heard a voice in the hallway. I walked to the door and observed Mr. Fenn standing very close to a hospital porter in a manner that appeared physically intimidating. I heard him make a statement that I interpreted as a direct threat to her employment. I entered the hallway and said something. He left. That's what happened. One of the trustees leaned slightly forward. You say you interpreted it as a threat. He told her that administration should reconsider whether the position suited someone at her level, Ben said. She was alone in the hallway holding a mop. He was standing close enough that she couldn't take a full step back. Silence. Fenn adjusted his cufflinks. A subjective reading from a visitor with no context for the conversation. Ben looked at him. You also tapped her ID badge. Once, deliberately, like it was something you were allowed to touch. The room was very quiet. The Meridian representative cleared his throat. This isn't characterization of a gesture that. Judith placed her folder flat on the table without opening it. Before we continue, she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who had spent years in rooms like this and had learned exactly how much weight a sentence could carry when it arrived at the right moment. I'd like to note for the record that my office has conducted a 4-day operational review of Meridian Group's consulting conduct at this facility. What that review has produced is material to this conversation. Fenn turned to look at her for the first time. Something in his expression recalibrated instantly. The way a person looked when they realized the room they were standing in was different from the room they had believed they were standing in. Judith, Director Harlan, she said quietly. The legal counsel looked between them. I'm sorry, your office? The State Attorney General's Office of Healthcare Compliance. Judith opened the folder. Over 14 months, this office received 16 complaints regarding conduct by Meridian Group personnel at facilities under their contract management. 6 individuals who filed those complaints have since left this hospital's employ under circumstances our office considers irregular. Mr. Fenn personally approved the termination or non-renewal of 4 of those 6. One of the trustees had stopped writing entirely. The Meridian representative said, that information is on record, Judith said. Formally, Fenn was very still now. Ben had seen this before, not in boardrooms but in narrower places. The moment when someone who had built everything on the assumption that no one would look closely enough realized someone had. Fenn tried once more. This entire review is compromised by the fact that you concealed your identity and your position while operating within a facility under active contract. Authorized undercover compliance review, Judith said. Clause 14 of the State Healthcare Oversight Act. My presence here was legal, documented, and approved by the AG's office before I set foot in this building. Fenn's lawyer, who had entered quietly during the folder exchange, leaned forward and touched Fenn's arm. Fenn did not move. The trustee who had been writing looked up. Mr. Fenn, I need to ask directly. Did you initiate contact with external vendors and property managers in connection with a civilian who witnessed an incident involving your conduct at this hospital? Fenn said nothing. Ben watched the silence. He did not fill it. He had learned that sometimes silence was the only honest contribution a person could make to a moment like this. The trustee tried again. Did you contact? My attorney will be responding to procedural questions going forward, Fenn said. The trustee removed her glasses, slowly. She set them on the table and looked at the legal counsel and said 3 words, call our attorney. It did not take long after that. Not in the room, anyway. In the room it was quiet and procedural, and careful. The way things were when the outcome had already been decided and what remained was paperwork. The Meridian Group representative excused himself. Fenn's attorney arrived by phone. Two of the 5 people at the table asked questions that were really just statements pointing in the same direction. Ben sat and answered what he was asked and did not add anything extra. At one point, a trustee asked him why he had gotten involved in the first place. Ben thought about it for a genuine moment. "My daughter was upstairs waiting for me," he said. "She's 7. She's been watching how I do things since her mom died. And the way I figure it, how you act when nobody important is watching is the only version of you that's actually real." The trustee looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something down. Fiend was escorted from the building by hospital security 40 minutes later. Not loudly. That was the thing about power that actually collapsed. It didn't make the noise people imagined. It just went quiet in a particular way that felt permanent. Outside in the parking structure, Ben stood beside his truck in the afternoon light. Judith came out a few minutes after him, coat on, credentials put away, carrying the same folder. She stopped beside him. "The warehouse lease," she said. "Once our office issues the formal finding, Meridian's retaliatory actions against third parties become part of the documented record. The AG can compel restoration of impacted contracts." Ben nodded. "It'll take a few weeks." "I know how to hold," he said. She looked at him. "You didn't have to come today. I could have built the case without you in that room." "I know." "Why did you?" Ben thought about Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator. The house, the tree, the crown. "Because she was watching," he said. "Not today. But she watches everything, and when she asks me later about the times things were hard, I want her to know I didn't go home and wait for someone else to handle it." Judith was quiet for a moment. "Your daughter sounds like someone worth showing up for," she said. "She drew herself with a crown," Ben said. "She definitely is." That made Judith laugh. Small and genuine, the kind that arrived before people decided whether they intended to laugh. Then she handed him an envelope. Not thick. Just a single folded page inside. He opened it standing there. It was a letter on AG letterhead formally acknowledging Ben Calloway as a protected witness in an active compliance investigation and requesting that all entities be advised that any further interference with his business operations would constitute obstruction of a state proceeding. Ben looked at it, then at her. "That's not charity," Judith said. "You witnessed the initiating incident. It's accurate." "Still," Ben said. "Still," she agreed. "Go get your daughter." He drove to school pickup that afternoon with the letter in his jacket pocket and the orange cracker wrapper from 3 days ago still in the cup holder, which Sophie had refused to let him throw away because she claimed it was lucky. Sophie came out of school in the particular way she did when she had had a day that was mostly good. Half run, half skip, backpack bouncing, looking for him before she had fully cleared the door. She climbed in, she buckled, she said, "Did you win?" Ben looked at her in the rearview mirror. "We're still standing," he said. Sophie considered this. "That means yes, but with feelings about it, pretty much." She nodded as though this was satisfactory. Then she looked out the window at the afternoon going past and said, "Can we get those crackers again?" "We can always get those crackers," Ben said. He pulled into traffic, and the late sun came in sideways through the windows, and Sophie hummed something to herself that had no particular tune, the way she did when she felt settled, and Ben let the drive go long on purpose, taking the longer route through the neighborhood with the old elm trees that she liked, because there were days when the drive home was itself a kind of answer to every question that didn't have one. And this was one of those days, and he knew enough by now to not shorten them. The story did not end in a single afternoon. 3 weeks later, the AG's office issued formal findings against Douglas Fenn and Meridian Group covering retaliation, improper contract interference, and conduct violations across 11 facilities in the state. Fenn was removed from his position. An independent trustee was appointed to oversee the vendor relationships at 6 of the affected hospital networks. Walter Gaines, the property manager who had sent Ben that first inspection notice, called to personally apologize. He said Fenn's company had been threatening lease renewals across the district for years. He said he was relieved someone had finally drawn a clear line. Ben thanked him and meant it without holding anything against him, because pressure made people do things they would not otherwise choose, and he understood that more than most. The 2 service contracts that had been pulled were restored. A third came through from the hospital district itself. The first time Ben had worked directly with a municipal health facility. He hired a part-time assistant to cover the new workload, a recently retired electrician named George who had steady hands and brought donuts on Fridays without being asked. Sophie started 3rd grade in September and was assigned to write a paragraph about someone she admired. She wrote about her dad. The teacher sent Ben a copy with a note that said simply, "She's got your stubbornness and her mother's heart." Ben put it next to the drawing on the refrigerator and they stayed there together. 2 crooked declarations about the same people, which was its own kind of record. One evening in October, with the yard going gold outside and Sophie asleep upstairs, Ben sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and thought about the afternoon in the hospital corridor. How the whole thing had started because he was returning to his daughter with a pack of orange crackers and he heard a voice carrying a particular kind of coldness, and something in him had simply refused to walk past it. He was not sure that was courage. He was not sure it was anything more than the habit of paying attention that 7 years of fatherhood had made automatic. But he thought that maybe those were the same thing, most of the time. Outside, the tree in Sophie's yard stood bare-branched and indifferent to all of it, the way trees stood through everything, which was quietly and without needing to be thanked. And Ben Calloway finished his cold coffee and turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. And the house held everything it was supposed to hold, and that was enough.